I would like to thank you for joining us for tonight's Lyceum Lecture. My name is Catherine Bedard, and I am a sophomore Lyceum Scholar studying economics here at Clemson. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Alex Hindman. Dr. Hindman is an assistant professor of political studies at the College of Holy Cross. He teaches a variety of courses on the U.S. Constitution, American government, and judicial politics. Dr. Hindman earned his Bachelor of Arts from St. Vincent College and his MA and PhD from Claremont Graduate University. He is published in the Annual Review of Political Theory and Public Life, Human Rights and Global Focus, and Fortune magazine. He is also author of the book, Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers, Preserving the Constitutional Presidency in the Post-Watergate Period. Tonight, Dr. Hindman will be giving a talk titled Beyond Gridlock, Constructive Majorities and the Separation of Powers. Please join me in giving a warm Clemson welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Alex Hindman.
Okay. Holy Cross, this is the biggest class I would ever teach at Holy Cross, so getting mic'd is a bit of a new experience for me. But great to be here. Thanks, Katie, for your warm welcome. I'm delighted to be at Clemson, and I'm delighted to have the chance to talk with you a little bit about the Constitution. My thanks to Brad Thompson, the Lyceum program here, my friend Mike Hoffpower, for bringing me out to talk with you about something I think is really important but overlooked when it comes to our constitutional system. I'm also grateful to the Jack Miller Center for paying my way and helping me get here for sure. Much of my, as Katie alluded to, much of my academic work revolves around how the law structures our politics, right? So the law exists on paper, but how do we interact with it? How do political office holders interact with it? How it constrains and encourages the types of political choices constitutional officers make. I'm doing this wrong, I think. Let me try that again. Maybe that's better. When I ask my students at Holy Cross, what's the separation of powers about? What do they think of? They nearly universally understand its function as limiting the powers of government to prevent tyranny. And while that's part of the story, my view is that it's only half of the story, right? The separation of powers is not merely a prophylactic against despotism and tyrannical regimes, but instead, as my title suggests, it sort of acts like a family meeting, right? It forces us to mediate our differences and work through disagreements and difficulties to actually build consensus and forms not an element of opposition, but as a source of unity as we work through challenges that we face. The structure of the powers is designed to lead us towards some semblance of a more perfect union by dividing them and locking them in competition. So by dividing power between the president, Congress, and the judiciary, and then we, like cats in a barrel, right? We throw them in a barrel and slap the lid on, right? And say, they're gonna have to sort this out, right? They're gonna have to deal with the political challenges that we face, and they're trapped in there with one another. And the only way they figure it out, it's like escape room. Like if you've done an escape room where you get thrown in with a bunch of people, right? You have to kind of sort your way through the outcomes, right? That forced working together, doing the hard work of union, is something we don't think about when we think about the Constitution. As you might be aware, if you've looked at any political news recently, union does not seem to be very much on people's minds these days. We're living through a period of intense political division. In a recent 2002 poll, nearly 75% of both parties believe that the other party is generally bullies who wish to impose their political beliefs on those who disagree. More sobering, 28% of Americans on both sides of the political divide believe that at some point soon, citizens might need to take up arms against their government. In January of 2023, 71% of all Americans, both political parties, believe that their country is on the wrong path. I don't need to tell you, we have some challenges, right? We have some very serious challenges. And at a basic level, right, these divisions don't seem to have much to do with the Constitution. Our civil society is anything but civil right now, right? And performative politics seem to be the order of the day. However, I would contend that a more serious commitment to America's civic constitutionalism might provide a path out of our difficulties. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that our Constitution is, quote, made for a people of fundamentally differing views. And we would all be better served, I think, by thinking institutionally about our commitments to constitutional forms. My home state of Massachusetts and South Carolina have found themselves on the opposite ends of important political debates in American history. We've had profound disagreements over the nature of the Union, over the role of alcohol and prohibition, the role of the federal government, whether there ought to be a national bank, whether there ought to be a New Deal, or whether or not we have Obamacare, immigration, on and on and on. Nonetheless, each of these intensive disagreements are refracted through our political institutions. And my argument is that the experience of nearly 250 years empirically demonstrates the resilience of our institutional structures and the separation of powers. So our Constitution has survived these moments and held us at least sort of together tolerably. While it's not been pleasant, we've survived Reconstruction after a Civil War, massive territorial expansion, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, Watergate, the Cold War, 9/11, and the COVID pandemic. More than merely preventing a concentration of governmental power, the separation of powers has forced Americans to discuss their disagreements, sometimes passionately, and meeting the pressures of necessity throughout our history. All of this is not without cause, is my argument, because the Constitution established the process by which we engage in the hard efforts of talking with each other, searching for the truth, and finding solutions to meet practical necessities. Our impulsive, pragmatic character, the get-it-done attitude that we have that animates our commercial republic, right? We lean in on business, we lean in on economic development. It's made us, the most prosperous country in the world, at least for a little bit longer, right? We've been made a powerful commercial republic because of a lot of characteristics that are innate in Americans. But that natural proclivity we have to get things done fast, to look for the efficient solution, is an asset in the economic realm, but may not be an asset when it comes to brokering political compromise among our fellow citizens. By slowing our natural proclivity for these speedy solutions, and often impulsive ones where we haven't really thought it through entirely, we bring each other along. And in this sense, the Constitution, in my mind, is a form of soulcraft, right? It crafts Americans to be better Americans. We're forced to deal with each other, even when our instinct would say no. By bringing each other along, debating, fighting, and hopefully persuading our fellow citizens that our picture of the world and the justice that we understand and what that policy demands when we determine what is right, true, and just is the real benefit of what we have in a regime, right? What we have in our Constitution. We deliberate with each other through Republican institutions, structured as they are, fundamentally, I would argue, by our constitutional separation of powers. As Dr. Hofpower and others know well from ancient philosophy, the need for these debates extends from fundamental questions of political philosophy, because men and women differ profoundly on questions of justice. What is justice, or how we ought to live, are perennial questions that the Constitution itself provides some guidance on, but very limited. It leaves open a lot of these questions to contention, disagreement, and debate. And it allows us, as a self-governing people, to set certain things off limits, but to leave a lot unsaid. It's born in doubt. In some sense, I would say, right, that general structure of our laws is rooted in a particular period in American history in the late 1700s. And in 1787, the American answer to the question of what is justice required a democracy, right? We were stuck with each other. We had to sort of make it work. We threw off King George and established a regime rooted fundamentally in natural rights and human equality because there was no other option. I mean, you could have appointed George Washington king, but would people who bled out on the battlefield tolerate a king in America, right? Would George Washington himself, as he had to turn it down multiple times, have tolerated becoming king? So there was really no other option, no one that would suit the American character. How do you make that government, though, lasting, accountable, and modestly successful was the problem they had to wrestle with. And we take for granted that liberal democracy and republics exist now, right? We sort of operate on the assumption that it's always been this way. It's the water we swim in if we were fish, right? But the framers wanted a government that was both popular and good. And that, in fact, I think is a tall order, given all of human history up to that point. Democracies were fatally flawed, or so the story went, until the framers said, let's give it another go. And in that, there's something about American optimism that I think we often forget. That optimism, I argue, was not wholly misplaced, in part because they believed that the Enlightenment had rendered new science, new methods, right, a new science of politics, to figure out the secret sauce. How do we make a democratic people actually deal with each other fairly, appropriately, search out the common good without descending into despotism? Alexander Hamilton said, this is a new science of politics that the institutions of government could be arranged in such a way to facilitate good outcomes. Those good outcomes had previously eluded ancient republics, and in my view, given popular government a bad rap. This is a longer argument. We can do that if I come back to Clemson and wonderful, beautiful upstate South Carolina sometime in the future. But let me touch on a few key points here. What are those institutional new science of politics arguments? The first is that the United States had a written constitution. We take it for granted that we wrote things down. Roughly 6,000 words. It's one of the shortest, right, constitutions in continuous operation in the West. And I think this idea derives from the Magna Carta, right? But we hope that by writing these powers down, categorizing the institutions, structuring the orders by which we organize our powers, they could be known and taught for all time. Individuals could be held to pre-existing rules and agreements, much like contracts in the business world, and the written character of this contract could be formed. Americans sought the clarity of timeless values and process with words in the hopes that they could constrain governmental excess and prevent or at least mitigate the centrifugal forces that tended to pull apart democratic regimes. So you have a written constitution. That's my first point. The second point I want to touch on is representation. And this one, when you stand back from it, I think this is the real innovation. You have the element of a Republican form. You have the idea that you elect someone out of your number to represent you. And the criteria you use, right, to do that is a little sin against pure democracy. So you insulate democracy with a little sin of recognizing someone is your better. Why do you run for class president, team captain, whatever? There's an element there that you're elevating someone above someone else. And this would be wholly out of the question for a pure democracy. James Madison, the Federalist, notes that for popular government to survive, it must have a way of separating the public whim or temporary public passions from the longer, more stable, well-thought ideas, the ones we settle on after we talk. Students of Federalist 10 know that the causes of faction is the result of this unrefined and unreflective immediate passions that animate the public. And the aim of a well-constructed republic is to escape these problems by electing representatives of the people to deliberate on their behalf. Under a well-formed constitution, Madison claims, quote, "It may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant, not less, to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for that purpose." The deliberations of representatives will better promote the common good because they're more knowledgeable and they have more experience and they can make their decisions in an institutional environment that fosters collective reasoning about shared interests. Thus, deliberative majorities will not normally exist independent of governing institutions. So you have to posit those representatives somewhere that they can reach a collective understanding and a collective good. how one constitutes those governing institutions becomes essential to fostering collective judgments. And thus we are led to a separation of powers as an additional security over top of this representative principle. And that's my third point. If all we cared about was having popular control of our representatives, the majoritarian impulse would be fine. We just swipe right, swipe left, vote for whatever policies you want. We have the technology to do that, right? But there's something else that's going on. And so the idea is that we embrace all of these numerous veto points, and you need to have these auxiliary precautions, as Madison says, to get at good government. And this is all right out of Fed 51 if you're looking for more homework in April, I know. The hard lesson the framers learned during the decade between the Declaration and the Constitution was that weak government could be just as dangerous as a strong one. And the art of creating a government that was strong enough to do all the things you'd want a government to do, protect the nation, secure liberty, guard against majority factions, do justice, promote the common good, and at the same time, not lose sight of who sent them, rest on the consent of the governed, and not become despotic was very difficult. To do this well, the Constitution had to take into account the dual character of human nature and meeting necessities. My late teacher, Michael Ullman, used to say that the founders knew that they needed a government that does not accommodate you just on your best day. You need a government that works on your bad day as well. Rather than attempt to bend human nature as tyrants do, the framers needed to construct a regime that worked for both fallible and noble parts of the human soul. Through various mechanical devices in their Constitution, the framers sought to construct a regime that would permit and encourage good ideas, good people, and good principles to rule, and would prevent the worst by setting these devices in place so that they would be difficult for bad people to take over. In summation, this is what the separation of powers allowed the framers to do. They could crank up the heat. You could crank up the strength of your government and still keep government accountable by taking the natural instincts and ambitions of human beings and arranging them institutionally to create inherent rivalries between the branches of government. And these branches, and these rivalries between these branches serve to both check and encourage the best ideas out of each representative. Zooming in a little tighter on separation of powers, how did they make this possible? First, the framers believed that distinctions could be drawn between governmental powers as opposed to how we think of power today. Right? We think of power singular, right? They thought, what if we chop it up? And we can identify the three different types of power, legislative, executive, and judicial power. And then you could draw out the way those powers could be placed in institutionally structured branches to be able to get at best doing the thing we ask them to do. Think about it, right? Congress is giant, it's loud, it has a lot of people that are seeking attention. It covers every corner of the country. There is a representative for every American, right? You have these clashing of interests and this diversity of views designed in that branch to serve legislative goals, to do legislative power well. The executive branch, execution of the laws, exercising discretionary authority, preventing invasion, responding to immediate necessity. One person can do that better than most. Better than many, right? The judiciary applies general rules to particular circumstances, and the nature of our legal system demands a certain degree of insulation from political control, and the independent judiciary allows judges, when you're the unpopular defendant in the docks, to make the right call and preserve what you are lawfully entitled to. Another point, each branch did not admit of a strict separation, but is given shares of powers, traditionally that dabble in the other branches' authorities. In the war powers debate, for instance, Congress is granted the power of declaring war, making rules regulating the armed forces, but the president is given operational command of those forces. And what I want to suggest is that's one example of multiple areas where these overlapping policy areas, this interest in multiple policy areas, encourages mutual interest of two separate power centers, two separate constituencies. And finally, the institutional designs of each of the branches form the character of those who occupy those places. Qualifications, 25 years for the House, 30 years for the Senate, 35 years to become president. There's a natural skewing towards wisdom the farther up and less democratic those elected branches become. One of the big ones, though, for deliberation that I want to call your attention to is the fact that we have staggered elections and varied term lengths. What you're doing is you're creating individual snapshots of public opinion every 2 years. We have people in the Senate right now that were elected in 2019 representing the public opinion from 2019 in our Constitution today. And that stability over time is an important influence on the deliberative character that I want to argue is my main point for tonight. The differences across constituencies. Homogeneous districts within states for the House, states which are slightly more diverse but not entirely, right? And South Carolinians think differently than people from Montana, and you have an institution that represents those views. So when you take these all together, each of these office holders in each of these institutions embody a variety of attributes and represent different snapshots of political time, different geographies, different levels of education, different levels of experience, and we throw all those cats in the barrel and say, sort out our policies. And there's a remarkable nuance to that. All of these institutional devices together, and I could talk more about this, serve to constrain and enable constitutional officers to perform their duties well. The other piece that's really important here is we blame our Constitution for our substantive differences on questions of justice. And I think that's an important part of this story. When the problem is, right, we can't get people to agree with our view of justice, we say we need to abolish the filibuster, right? We need to pack the court, right? The point is we blame the policy for the fact that we don't want to blame each other for recognizing that we have fundamental disagreements on questions of justice. And I think that's a wildly important innovation. It institutionalizes and legalizes what would otherwise has the potential, I think, to rip a country apart. So, on the one hand, you can see government as constraining power, right? Separation of powers does this. I mean, pick your worst example of your opponent in a political party, right? You can pick your poison, right? There are many options. And imagine his or her cronies. Imagine what it would take for them and their political party to dominate your lives without any recourse for you. Under the separation of powers and federalism, that party would have to take all 50 state governments, all 3 branches of the federal government, including a bicameral Congress. All of this would have to be accomplished in a regime that embraces staggered elections. It would have to win the House, a third of the Senate, and a presidency over a sustained period of time to capture the courts. This is remarkably difficult for any potential revolutionary tyrant because of the multifaceted nature of American public opinion and the fact that it's all integrated into that system. But this is directly related to my next point. We can see the same Constitution for its positive outcomes. The multifaceted nature of American public opinion, when refracted through the same Constitution, brings a variety of views into the government and forces them to work together. We have a SCOTUS justice in Georgia native Clarence Thomas who existed on the court before the internet was a thing, right? In 1991, he went to the court. Senator Ed Markey and Elizabeth Warren, my senators from Massachusetts, find themselves in the same chamber with Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott. Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, can't escape the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. President Biden might not like the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, but he cannot escape the fact that they remain the Supreme Court. It stands to reason that if any of those people want to accomplish anything, they're better off talking with one another. And as the framers designed their own personal ambitions to be good at their jobs, Senator Schumer wants to be a good senator, presumably, right? Being a good senator demands certain things happen, and those things that must happen is he must get other players in the system to agree. They must convince or overcome the ambitions of their political interlocutors to get their way. By virtue of the Constitution, these office holders of fundamentally different views cannot escape each other. The diffusion of power among these 3 branches make it hard for any one of their embodied understandings of justice to run the day without at least tacit consent or surrender on the part of the other. The Constitution creates a diffusion of powers and interests, draws them under one roof, and forces them to work together. In this sense, the constraining function, the presence of the no, is integral to the consensus building function. These functions must operate in tandem because if you know you'll be opposed and frustrated by your opponent, you're more likely to take them and their views seriously. Thus, the Constitution grants diverse voices both the authorities and powers to be involved in the process and the legitimacy in their offices to have their views heard out and taken seriously. In the end, although they might not prevail in the majority rule system as we have, their views are aired. To put it another way, each branch possesses sufficient authorities to get a say in the common debate, and their place in the common debate cannot be ignored. In my book project Katie mentioned, I worked to show how Gerald Ford's embrace of the Constitution helped him have a modestly successful presidency after the disaster of the Nixon-Watergate scandal. In 1974, in the midterm elections, Gerald Ford found himself unelected, associated with a failed presidency, and especially after he pardoned Richard Nixon. The reaction in the midterm elections gave veto-proof majorities of Democrats in both houses of Congress. And without the Constitution, it's my contention, there was no political reason for his Democratic rivals to take him seriously. With the Constitution, Gerald Ford had a seat at the table and was able to prevent what would have been, in my view, lasting damage to the presidency, and I would argue to our country as a whole. There's often a lot of talk, Richard Neustadt talks about the power of persuasion being central to the presidency. And my contention is the separation of powers makes the power of persuasion possible for unpopular voices. Former U.S. Attorney General Ed Levy noted that the American system, and he borrowed this from a British scholar named Walter Bagehot, he said, we're a government by discussion. And the more free debate we have, the better laws and policies we are able to form when we engage in the searching truth that can only come from finding out what's wrong with how we think, not vanquishing our opponents. The more we're courageous enough to have real discussion, the better instruments of government we'll have. While we might always do better in this search for truth, the Constitution compels it, at least up to a point, by inserting broad swaths of views from around the country, across multiple election cycles, and with distinctly different types of human beings in various roles in this drama. The airing of these ideas is intended to form those better instruments. To return to my title for a minute, the separation of powers is more than merely checking governmental power from tyrannical excess. It is a way of unifying and building consensus, because the Congress is divided into two chambers, both House and Senate. They must find agreement, and this requires a refining and enlarging of the public views, as Madison says in Fed 10. The President and administration must weigh in and under threat of veto, and a national constituency, long view, is integrated. And after all these actions are taken, courts get to weigh in with an even longer view. Policy entrepreneurs, my lesson is, policy entrepreneurs are wise to take all of these views into account and incorporate diverse interests, or they won't get past the potential no's that may come. As Thomas Jefferson said in his first inaugural, it is not enough that we have majority rule in this country, but that it is a sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable. The Constitution tries to keep harmony by making our national policy determinations go through this weird schoolhouse rock process, right? You can find it on Disney Plus if you're out there. It's something you just search around, it's there, right? Everyone has a right to express and act on their discontent, so to build a majority, you must listen broadly. In this sense of constructing majority, making it a constructive majority, you can get a majority that coalesces behind an idea, making the policy more stable, more inclusive, and more lasting. The majority becomes constructive in terms of what we're building in American political development more broadly. But the Constitution helps in another way to preserve harmony and domestic tranquility if we embrace it more openly. The airing of opinions through the process makes it easier for the losing party to dispute a losing policy dispute, to accept it more easily, even if begrudgingly. When the rules of the game are followed, a loser can be gracious, knowing full well that they might be in the majority next time. The rivalry is never over, right? I know I wore an orange tie, so I'm a partisan of the Tigers, right? But I know it was a rough one against South Carolina by one. I'm sorry, that's really, right, 1 point, right? But you know that there's always next year, and you've beat them 43 times since the rivalry has begun, right? So you have a lot of hope there. The winner and loser will always be stuck with each other, and so they might as well get along. To wrap this up, today, because we lack a civic education, I think, that teaches us to love the gridlock of our system for its positive reasons. We only think about it as opposing what we as a democratic society want. Instead of thinking about it positively, we find voices on both the right and the left today that advocate that we must fundamentally remake our Constitution for the present circumstances. Pick your poison: climate change, gun control, immigration, the debt crisis, the failure of some of our banks so far, the bloat in Washington, D.C., right? All of which seem to demand immediate actions, have advocates, policy entrepreneurs who all have slapdash solutions that will fix it all tomorrow and lead to a bright utopian future. Fortunately for us, our framers were optimistic but skeptical about utopian visions and erected systems to prevent rash, impulsive changes in favor of more settled, constructive majorities. In a diverse country of over 326 million people, with 200 different religious denominations, every race in the world, a diverse geography, a wide array of occupations, technology, and our large commercial republic, our differences are inherent in our diversity. If diversity is our strength, as we often hear it said today, we must find a way to forge unity out of that diversity. What do we agree on? And I think reinvigorating the Constitution forces that family meeting, that hard family meeting, if you've ever fought with your siblings, right, to search out how each of us might be wrong in the family spats we have in our politics. Alexis de Tocqueville noted that the constitutional forms become more important, not less, as the power of government increases. At a time when the demands on our government rise and the government's response to these challenges is directly proportional to those expectations, constitutional forms become all the more important, not less. Our individualism, our liberty, is better secured and more complete when we think and act through our collective constitutional institutions. So let me end appropriately with an appeal for the Lyceum program, right, to Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address, which you should all check out, right, for all of us to hewn new pillars of support for American constitutional institutions from the solid quarry of sober reason. We've got to think about it. We must choose to support our constitutional institutions in a country whose noble and passionate commitment to justice requires a similar commitment to law-abidingness, if that justice is to ultimately be something more than ephemeral. I thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions. I'm sorry if that was a sensitive subject about the Gamecocks, but there's this year, I'm optimistic. It's a good time to be a Tiger, right? Happy to field some questions, for sure.
So my question's, so you talked a lot about Federal 10 and the fact that we don't have rulers in this country.
Sure.
But increasingly we see deference given to the Supreme Court, who seems to be just this is to quote one of my favorite professors here.
Sure.
Zeus on Mount Olympus, throwing lightning bolts at case law and declaring things. So how does that balance the separation of powers and the Supreme Court ending up being the final arbiter and the quote-unquote ruler, where the Constitution is designed to not have law?
Sure. So I'm going to restate your question for the recording a little bit here, right? You're arguing that the Supreme Court has taken on such an outsized role in our politics. How do we rectify this with the separation of powers? I think this is the real question we have to wrestle with. I don't know what the appropriate role of the court is, to be honest with you. I think my general view is to have some sort of deep, more or less textual commitment to the Constitution, but also recognizing that there are principles that are embodied in the Constitution that need to be brought to bear on our politics. I think there's a lot of lawyers in our political class who believe that courts get to decide final questions with finality. And I'm skeptical of the fact that, just because the court gets an opinion on these things, that it ought to be the final word, that we can't continue to debate and have important debates politically about sensitive issues like reproductive health, gun rights, pick your voting rights, pick whatever you want to talk about. And I think sometimes we've elevated them to the Zeus type status where we're unwilling to criticize them, right? Now, I'm not saying, this instantly puts me in a box with people who criticize the independent judiciary. There's a way to do it, right? There's a way to do it substantively. And there's a way to raise challenges there. And I think that's more of what we need to see. We need to see constructive majorities emerge in the policymaking branches. It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to get out of the box necessarily on this too. Sure.
So in relation to education more recently, and I think to some extent you could describe it as a war over education, looking at what children are being taught, how they're being taught, being taught what to think versus how to think is a big thing that comes up. And so what would you say a constitutional response to this war over education would be?
I was promised good questions from Clemson, right? And that's fantastic. Yeah, so the question is how do we address constitutionally this war and this profound debate we're having over education, what our kids are taught, what our kids are not taught. I'm generally I believe in the principle of subsidiarity, right? It's from old Catholic social teaching where you devolve decisions about education to the lowest possible rungs that you can do, right? So you push those questions low, right? And so local folks, states, localities, get to determine the outcome and what they want their children to learn. I'm skeptical of giant solutions that treat folks in Montana the same way as you would want your children taught in South Carolina. There may be similarities there, but I'm generally a fan of state-level decisions on something like that and addressing some of those questions locally. It doesn't solve the problem and the real substantive disagreements we have over it, and it doesn't solve the problem of frankly failed school districts, right, that have failed students in certain ways. Maybe there's a need for a national standard. I always go back and forth. Scratch me on a different day and I can come down on it differently. But I think there's an element of, local people and parents should have an influence on what their kids are taught. I don't know. It's a great question though. Sure. Cool. Yeah, sure. We'll go here and then we'll come up front.
Kind of along the same line. So you make a compelling argument for the separation of powers, but now we're bringing a little bit more of like an argument for localism and decreasing the federal government as a whole. So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on the relationship between, like we have this separation of powers that is unifying us and refining our views between the branches, all this stuff, but also a need to just like lower the scope as in a whole to make it less dangerous to begin with.
Yeah, so help me I just want to make sure I'm getting it, right? So the argument about the need for horizontal separation of powers, and then I make an argument for devolution, right, which might reduce those scope. Yeah, I think they can live in the same regime, right? I think you can have a system that deals with some substantive questions at a really local level well, but when they rise to national solutions, in my view, they should be serious national issues. But I think more power centers for substantive questions is really better, right? If you in the state of South Carolina decide through a democratic process, through your governor, your state assembly, your courts, that this is the way you want to proceed on any one of these issues, I think the first choice should not be to centralize those decisions in Washington. Now, there's obviously some difficulties there, right? There's some things that rise to levels of national principle that we got to be careful with. But by and large, I think that world could be copacetic. You have multiple power centers all jockeying for good ideas. And maybe South Carolina will figure it out, right? And then you sort out the difference between, what appropriate ways in which sex education should be taught to children in South Carolina and what ways it should not be taught. And maybe other states can replicate that. I think that's part and parcel for the older understanding of the way we thought about those questions. Good question, though. Come up here, yeah, for sure.
So with the growth of the administrative state and a slew of government agencies making rules and regulations independent and not having to talk with other branches of government, how much of a threat do you see these agencies as, and how do you check them in their power?
Yeah, so this is the million-dollar question, and this is sort of at the vanguard of some of the things that are happening in sort of public law and constitutional law. So the question is what do we do with the proliferation of agencies at the federal level that have, by virtue of legislatively passed laws, the ability to write rules implementing federal statutes, to tell citizens whether they violated those statutes, right? To essentially act as legislative, executive, and then turn around and judge whether those rules were correctly applied. There's a number of cases, particularly concerning the EPA, but there are other examples of this as well, where there are agencies created by Congress that exercise all three of those powers. I don't know what the solution is. I think it's going to take Congress getting back in the game in some way, right? Congress is really performative right now, right? It's about Twitter is not real life, right? You want to be able to amass followers and show up on your favorite television news program and show up on the radio and do the press for it and be a celebrity for being a member of Congress. And I don't think a lot of our Congress folks are thinking institutionally that they've given the president, right? They've given the president and people who report to the president of both parties, right? It was under Trump as well, right? Significant authorities to guide people's lives in whole swaths of it, right? Whole swaths of FCC regulation. Can you get a radio license or not? Do you have, the FCC, do you have the right internet? You guys might have remembered net neutrality a few years ago, right? The net neutrality debate that was out there. All held, that debate was an internal debate among the commissioners of the FCC. To me, I don't know, changing the way we all access bandwidth for internet should rise to a serious question that Congress should wrestle with. And they'd much rather hide, I think, in a lot of circumstances, from taking tough votes. They'd much rather hide from taking tough votes. So if you're a member of Congress and you like a coal-fired power plant in your district, but you're also pro-green agenda, right? You have the ability to say, well, I've supported new appropriations to the EPA to allow the EPA to regulate coal-fired power plants. And then when in your district, when those regulations shut down 700 jobs in your district, you turn around and say, well, that's not what I was talking about. Not our coal-fired power plant. And what do? They can Michael Jackson moonwalk back off of all of these things and say, well, I was for it, but then I was against it, but then I'm for it, right? They're avoiding responsibility, whereas if they had to vote for those rules and regulations, we'd know, and we'd be able to make appropriate decisions accordingly. But all of that stuff has now been outsourced to these delegated agencies. I don't think it's a good look. But it comes from that, I'm filibustering now, but right, it goes back to the idea that someone has an idea that their view of justice is one that we should all subscribe to. And that doesn't build an inclusive community of people who come to consensus and agree about things, I don't think. I don't know. Great question, really good. Sir?
Does the Supreme Court play a role in rebalancing the powers between the executive and legislature?
Yeah, so that's a great question, particularly in the bureaucratic concepts. Yeah, so could the Supreme Court play a role? There have been a number of precedents in recent years, right? In recent years in Supreme Court history, 40 or so odd years, right? Where the court has pretty much said in a lot of circumstances, we're going to defer to the executive agencies when it comes to judging the nature of the rules and regulations they promulgate and their own interpretations of their statutory authorities. There's a little bit of an indication that the court is starting to revisit what we call Chevron doctrine and our deference, right? They're starting to nip at the edges of that a little bit. I think this court's going to go cautiously in that, because when you think about the whole apparatus of the sort of administrative agencies and administrative alphabet soup agencies we have, to start pulling too seriously and too rapidly at that would cause a lot more regulatory problems in how we approach it. So I think they're going to nip at the edges a little bit. I think really what needs to happen is there needs to be a presidential candidate who recognizes, and it can be Democrat, it can be Republican. I think Bill Clinton was getting close to this in the 1990s, where he said, we need to make this government more effective. And eventually the weight of the administrative agencies on the government are going to cause us some significant economic problems. And I think a president taking the bull by the horns a little bit here and moving Congress to get Congress back in the game might be the only way out. The court can provide a little bit of leadership, but I think it's got to come from somebody a little higher. Sure. Katie.
You mentioned at the end that our civic education might be lacking or might paint the Constitution in a more negative light. And I was wondering, how does seeing the Constitution in a negative light change the manner in which a young citizen might engage in political society or change what they value?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. So the question is we have this debate about civic education. If the presumption is that the Constitution doesn't serve our needs, and that is an early critical view of the Constitution, does that undermine sort of long-term civic education? I think, yeah. That's a great question, right? I think there's a way to do healthy criticism, right? There's a way to do healthy criticism. And I think one of the challenges, and I talk with my friends who are history professors about this, right? We can understand the history and the things that came off of the Constitution, and the events that were related to constitutional forms and misuses of the Constitution in significant ways, and still recognize a nuanced view that 250 years in this sort of thing isn't a bad outcome. And I think it's a both and type civic education we need in this country. But as we become more politicized about even that question, I think then we run into real problems where we're only teaching one, or we're only teaching one side of the story, and I don't think that ends well either way, because what you're doing is it's further wedging us, right? So you need a civic education that takes America's sins seriously and also recognizes the appropriate place for recognition. And I think that got out of balance in the last 50 or so years, and we got to rebalance some of that. It's a hard one. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So the question is do executive orders, correct me if I'm wrong, okay, that executive orders, are they unconstitutional? Do they change the nature of this separation of powers system? I think the answer is yes, right? You have executive orders. So an executive order at its most basic level is meant to give members of the bureaucracy a snow day when 2 inches of snow fall in Washington, D.C., right? It's meant to help run the bureaucracy. Increasingly, we've heard presidents of both parties, now the last three, assert that they can push the envelope of executive power in the executive order context to make substantive policy, right? Trump, build a border wall, executive order. Reappropriate money from military construction projects to build a border wall on the southern border. Obama, provide amnesty for dreamers, right? Good policy, substantive goal, right? Not disputing that. But by executive order, such that it becomes a question of whether Trump will rescind the executive order and revoke those people's protections. When going through Congress might have provided a more stable outcome for those folks. When you look at Biden, I'm still paying student loans, right? It would be nice. It would be nice to have him forgive a lot of my debt, right? But spending money in the size of the amount of money that would take to pay off all of our debt surely is a power of the purse. So there are ways in which presidents have pushed the envelope on these executive orders to become more and more capacious. And the argument they make is, well, Congress is asleep at the switch, right? Congress isn't doing it because they're doing nightly talk shows or whatever. And I think there's an important argument there. Congress, if they were to get back in the game and do some of the things that we expect them to do, you wouldn't see the other branches having to compensate for that. You wouldn't have a Supreme Court that is trying to determine national policy with nationwide injunctions. You wouldn't have presidents engaged in acts where they're maybe pushing the envelope on their executive authorities. I think the lack of Congress being in the game is, if you could get them to take their job seriously and think institutionally and not just simply play Santa Claus, you could really have a balanced system again. But these other branches are doing it poorly because they're filling in that void. I think this is one piece that's worth mentioning. The framers assumed that the branches would jealously guard their authorities. They would be ambitious about their authorities. Today, one branch, the first branch of government, Article 1, seems more concerned about how you feel about them in real time. Do you like them enough, right? They're playing mayor in their district. Instead of actually saying, hey, maybe we could have sensible gun control. Or not, whatever that is. Maybe we could have mental health care for people who are suicidal or running into mass shooting events or something like that. There's real substantive policy debates we could have about this if they got serious about it. And these guys are more concerned about posturing for your attention on the evening news, and I just don't think that's a good view. Yeah, sorry, I'm filibustering. I want to take as many of these as I can.
Do you believe the lack of term limits for congressional members creates a sort of complacency among the members just to keep their stay there longer rather than focus on policy while they're there? Because the lack of a time limit on their time there encourages them just to stall and stay as long as they can.
Hang out, yeah, forever, right? Yeah. So this is the big thing, right? So this is a controversial argument, right? The argument is, would term limits help this sort of congressional complacency? I think more heat from us would be good, right? More heat from the Democratic elected process. We return 95% of them on a consistent basis, right? If you're in a safe district, a gerrymandered district, and you're likely to be returned, we return them often. So term limits is an interesting solution to this problem. I always look at state legislatures that have instituted term limits for their folks. And in California, it has caused more administrative agencies to emerge because term-limited legislators, right before they're ready to walk out the door, create a new commission that gives them a job for life. So I'm always torn on this, right? I like the idea of turnover, but I worry about removing the choice from a voter, right? To be able to say, hey, yeah, maybe we need another term from Congressman so-and-so to enact this project. So it's always that weird trade, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good question though. I always ask my students this, so this is a good one. Part of me on one day likes the idea of like, let's get them out, right? Let's clean out the house, but I just don't know what they're gonna do after, right? And I'm not convinced they do much to help us out after the fact. Did I miss some? Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, so I remember at one presentation you said presumably a senator is trying to do a good job. How do external influences like lobbying or interests play a role?
You got it, right? No, that's right. So how do we wrestle with lobbying? How do we wrestle with the corrupt influences that are on the outside? I think this goes back to, the problem is us, right? And this goes back to one of the points that I say, we want to project the problem that we have onto the institution, like there's some institutional fix to this. I think if we know that people are doing insider trading or something like that, kick them out, right? Why are we sending them back to Congress, right? And a rule that we make to get at some of those questions, it's like water running downhill. We're dealing with people with bad character, right? And so if you have a person of bad character, you can erect whatever legislative solution around that. Eventually, you just need to divest them of their authority. Lobbying, gerrymandered districts, I'm skeptical of a way out of that. That's not the solution that's not worse than the disease, right? And so we better make sure we have a good way of saying lobbying reform is always nice, but campaign finance reform has historically helped incumbents. So whenever we propose campaign finance reform, it's a senator showing up at an airport and saying, I have a new announcement to make, and 5 media outlets show up to cover their arrival. I'm going to make a statement. They get access to free media, right? If we limit the ability of campaign finance to have an impact, we're tying one hand behind the back of challengers who might be able to shake up the system. And so it's this odd kind of balance, and we got to really think about what the unknown unknowns might be there. But I don't know how. I'm making a big assumption that they want to do a good job, and maybe they're just in it for themselves. And if that's the case, we need to remember when we throw the button in the ballot box. Yeah, sure, and then we'll come over to the back. Yeah.
So you mentioned the jealousy that the founders expected each branch to have.
Yeah.
And given that the legislature doesn't have that right now, does that reveal a problem in the Constitution itself, since we've gotten to this point in the Constitution?
No, that's a great question, right? There is some. Madison in Federalist 51 is clear that if you have people of bad character, right? If you don't have people who jealously guard their powers, think institutionally, take their jobs seriously, you have a problem, and there's no real way to secure that. So yeah, I think it is a problem with the way it's designed, or it's an assumption that we made. This is a great question. I'm kind of formulating it on the fly because I hadn't really thought about it. I think they assumed some things about the American mind. I think they assumed some things about the American character that would be stasis, that would be stable. People would want more power. People would want to aggregate that power. But we've redefined maybe what it means to be a congressman, being a local mayor, giving out goodies to kids on the parade float or whatever, right? Yeah, I don't know how you get it back, but I think it's a critique, right? We assumed that they would want their jobs, or they would want to do a certain thing in office, and they're not doing that. So what do we need to do about that? I don't know. Great question, though. Really good. Sir.
So the description of the goal of separation of powers to force a kind of family discussion and bring different pieces of the government together has seemed to come around to the fact that it's just two siblings and they get to fight it out every single time. Unexpected to the founders, obviously.
Sure.
Do you think that and they've set up the rules to ensconce themselves into that two-party system. Do you think that a structural reform, such as a proportional representation or other tweaks to the voting system, would better facilitate that kind of constructive majorities that we truly don't see, at least as a part, in part as a function of the two-party system?
Yeah, so there's some interesting innovative stuff going on in some jurisdictions with like ranked choice voting and some new proportional modes, rethinking how we elect candidates. I wish I knew more about sort of the ins and outs of that. I think it's worth a discussion, but this is a great example of federalism at work, right? Let's try it and let's see what happens. And in certain jurisdictions, you're not going to get party competition, right? And in my home state, right, the party margins are, I think, 3-1 Democrat to Republican. So you're going to get 2 Democrats on the ballot, right? You might not have the party competition that you want. So maybe you're going to trade that. And maybe that's a sacrifice we want to make to shake this thing up and get people going. I'm all about let's give it a whirl and see. But before we jump to do it nationally, let's let some states play with it and things for sure. No, great question, sir.
So you mentioned that good character is a prerequisite for, I think, good legislation.
Yeah.
And that was assumed even by the founders. But also that without ambition in our legislature, they quickly defer their power, and that's part of the problem that we have today.
Yeah.
So does that then require a cultural conception that ambition and good character can go hand in hand?
Oh, see, you guys are well trained here. This is great. Does good character and ambition mix, right? Does good character and ambition. We want citizens in a republic to have good character, but in the United States, right, we also rely on this rampant, rugged individualism, this pushing the boundaries. And I always go back to Tocqueville on this. Tocqueville says he wants self-interest rightly understood, right? Pushing the lawful limits of your authority, right? Making a better widget if you're a business person, right? Expand your market, right? Do the things you need to do to be competitive in the business sphere and the commercial markets. All of those things I don't think are cutting against the kind of prerequisites of good character and taking people's views seriously and dealing with fellow citizens, even though we disagree. I would still die for you on the battlefield, right? Those deep level questions, right? I think they can fit together well. And I think Tocqueville has a lot to say about this, right? The idea that you can have people passionately pushing, but within some measure of forbearance and restraint to allow good character to kind of emerge out of that. And where that balance is struck, if I had the answers, I'd be in a different line of work. But yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Hindman for his time tonight.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all.